such a good presenter. He has such an energy and passion about this space. I collaborate with him a lot. We love him. Lady in the camera loves him. Okay. So please stand by, everyone. I'm now getting the water, if you're curious what happened to me. A thirsty Anton leads to a more pessimistic Anton. Okay, Anton, here you go. Okay. Anton Chuvakin will be joining us in just a second. Again, Anton is a security strategist at Google Cloud. He's a big-time influencer. When Anton makes a claim or a statement or have a thought or an observation, people listen and the industry evolves. So Anton, thank you so much. Anton, how tall are you, Anton, by the way?
6'3".
Yeah, it's not normal I look up, but you I like the similar, yeah. My twin is a half-inch taller, at least a lot of sibling rivalry. All right, thank you. Here you go, Anton.
Thank you. Oh, wait. My remote. Yes. Well, in any case, so this, the original inspiration for this sort of a mini presentation came from me seeing a lot of security operations teams kind of being left with cloud in their lap and not being sure what to do with it. So this is kind of a SOC meets cloud kind of presentation where I will share some of the kind of early thinking about what a more traditional SOC brought up on like IPS, traditional devices should do or can do when they're given the responsibility to deal with this cloud stuff. Usually public cloud, to a lesser extent private cloud and SaaS. So yeah, so pretty much what I just said is kind of what such a security operations center would think of, like what are the challenges, what should they plan for, where they would trip and fall most likely, which existing approaches can be copied over with good results, which existing approaches would be copied over and cause bad results, and of course how to kind of approach it in the future. This is 15 minutes, so I'm not going to give you like a nice framework you can print and just go and follow, but I will give you some ideas about what things to avoid, what things to look for, and a few others. Now, before we go there, sometimes the question is, how sudden is a cloud change to some of the SOCs? I've seen people with literally almost like no warning when the company does digital transformation, starts digital transformation, adopts public cloud, and the SOC team is kind of given the fact that, hey, we are now in big public cloud provider X, let's just say Google or, well, whatever other. So the way I started to think about it is, okay, how do I talk to the SOC manager or SOC lead or SOC analyst about this whole transition to cloud? And after much agonizing, I kind of came up with a framework where we first look at like roughly the lay of the land, like where trouble may come from. We sort of assess what you have, and then you kind of act. This is very generic, but I promise I will film it in here in the next 15 minutes. So this is a quick reminder that of course comes from my, it's a short quote from my former employer, as some of you know. SOC is primarily a team. So when I say SOC, I don't mean a third-party subscription, and I don't mean the tools. I really mean this a group of people led by a SOC manager or somebody of similar stature. To me, when I hear SOC, I see a team. I see tools and processes. I can talk people, process tech, all the way. But ultimately, team is the primacy of team in SOC is the key, and so that's why it kind of colors what we are doing here. So one of the first things an analyst or a SOC manager would encounter is this whole vague, broad view of shared responsibility. And this is one of those staples of cloud security that everybody thinks they know, but nobody truly really does, especially in the area of detection and other responsibilities of SOC. So typically the cloud provider would publish a picture, usually with 2 colors, sometimes more colors, that says, we do this, you do this. And there are certain areas of this which are painfully obvious. Hardware. Who secures physical data centers? Of course it's a cloud provider, it's us, Google, in case of Google. Who secures the applications you just wrote? Well, probably you. Okay, great, very easy. What about all the rest of the stuff? Well, it's kind of nuanced. And to me, the detection stuff is kind of more nuanced, because who is detecting threats in the cloud? Well, what do you mean by threats? Who is detecting activities against the website or web-facing assets? Who is detecting activities by insiders if there are any of the insiders on the provider side, who is detecting things, who is detecting malware and things you brought to the cloud. It's really fuzzy. And shared responsibility model becomes a lot less crisp and a lot more multicolored and possibly also three-dimensional. If you hire an MSSP or an MDR, you have cloud provider does this, MDR does this, you do this. How about we go and argue between themselves who does something? That's a very painful exercise. So this is the first kind of encounter when I'm thinking threat detection. I'm thinking, but who does what? Who builds detection tools? Is it the CSP? Is it a third-party vendor? Do I use my existing tools? Can I bring my SIEM with you in the cloud? Yes, you can. Should you? Separate story. Who would handle the alerts? Probably not the cloud provider, except for alerts about their infrastructure. So there's more splitting. So the reason I'm showing this is that when people say, oh yeah, shared responsibility model, for detection it's a lot trickier and it involves a lot more thinking to figure it out. Now, I love writing those lists of problems that people would encounter, and of course it comes from a blog post I've written on what are the specific challenges a SOC would encounter when they see cloud for the first time. I'm not going to go through the list. I'm going to focus on my favorite. It's not about detecting aliens from space. It's about the fact that a lot of context, like this is an IP address, where's the server, who owns the server, what does the server do? This is the context for an on-premise detection. In the cloud, you may have, oh, it's an instance ID and it's from this project. Oh, okay, what does it mean? Well, I don't know, I need to look it up. So a lot of context that I would use to triage alerts is just completely different. It's not just an IP is an IP. Sure, there's a role for IP addresses in the cloud, but there's a lot of bunch of other stuff that maps to a bunch of other stuff. And I'm not even touching on IAM and other things. So to me, licensing models, a lot of people who showed up with on-premise tools that charge per endpoint had a lot of grief. Right now, vendors mostly smartened up, at least the smart ones did. So licensing for cloud based on IP is just frankly silly. Still, if I'm adopting my on-premise tools, I have to live with them. A lot of other things really ruin the day for a SOC manager who is trying to organize what he does and deal with these things. A lot of people obsess about the number 2. Yeah, cloud produces a lot of data. Well, frankly, it depends on your adoption model. You may be using cloud a little bit, data center a lot, so it may not be your problem today. But sometimes it's a question of the volume and who is paying for telemetry. What about a vendor that wants you to copy telemetry from one cloud to another? Somebody's paying for it somewhere. A lot of these come up and needs to be solved. How do we solve them? Well, let's start solving them. At least I've outlined some of the problem areas, and then let's start dealing with them. Now, let's assess what we have and how well what we have would work out. Before we do that, we need to answer one more question, which is supposed to be really simple, but it's really hard, as I learned. And this has been my other obsession lately. What are the relevant threats to your cloud environment? I've been asking people about this, I've been reading reports, I've been talking to different entities, and I'm noticing very little agreement. How about that? CSA, top threats to cloud computing. You read this, you match it to your environment, sometimes it matches, sometimes it doesn't. You read the threat report. Of course, everybody puts cryptominers on top. Does it mean that your only threat in the cloud is cryptominers? Probably not. Do I copy the same threat assessment I've made for my environment? Well, if you did lift and shift and you copied the environment to the cloud, you may be tempted to think the answer is yes. Well, the answer is no, because threats would change even if you just copy servers and the VMs. You wouldn't deal with physical threats anymore. You would deal with a lot more IAM issues. So this has, I don't have an answer here. I'm just saying that if you don't think there is a question here, I assure you, there is a question. Lately, a lot of people have been telling me that actually threats are kind of the same, they're just ranked differently. Cryptominers on-prem, they happen, but not a lot. Cryptominers in the cloud, high on top of the list. Other threats may be the same threats, but they would just be ranked differently. Good question, but the point is that you are thinking about it. Otherwise, you are not really doing DNR right, because if you're detecting threats, you are supposed to at least somewhat know what the threats are. And there's no white paper to download that just gives you a list. So that's a subject of doing threat assessment on your behalf for your environment to figure out what you should care about. And we will, like our own research will provide some help to this, but ultimately, a lot of this depends on how you use the cloud, what type of services, what type of business functions. But it's a question you may have to answer before you do other stuff. So this is the slide where I make a lot of fun over existing approaches, and I point out at all sorts of mistakes. So if you recognize some of the mistakes you made, please be aware that it's not your case specifically. Now, I've met a bunch of people who have a decent SIM or a log management tool, and they think that the main problem with the cloud is collection of the telemetry. So they get their tool X or tool Y, and they call Google, call other cloud providers and say, can I get my cloud audit, cloud trail, cloud telemetry in my SIM? Google cloud providers say, yes, you get all the telemetry. But then you realize, what is all this stuff? What does it mean? How does it point at use cases? How does it help me reveal the threats? Oh wait, I haven't really figured out threats yet. The point is that it's a really good way to enrich a particular vendor in here somewhere, in a different hole maybe, but ultimately it's not a direct route to doing SOC well in the cloud. You may have to collect things, but lacking awareness of threats, lacking use cases, lacking the clear detection purpose, it won't be the useful step, at least not to me. Now people say, okay, I don't want to think about it, I'm just going to copy everything I do, my business is doing lift and shift anyway, they're copying their IT practices, copying their IT approaches, I'm just going to copy my security approach. I don't want to say it's broken, because I've seen people start there and kind of eventually succeed. But this is where you end up with a lot of money that you spend. An organization once told me that they use a particular packet capture tool on premise, and I'm going to copy it to GCP, and I'm going to capture every packet that GCP has. GCP helpfully provided a packet mirroring technology to capture every packet. A lot of money changes hands. You have packets captured. What does it tell you? Again, not much. To me, this is a useful step for some, just to stay in the land of the familiar, but ultimately that's not going to be the end, especially as your cloud usage becomes more, technical term, cloudy. You use more cloud native services, less VMs, your stack would then be less of a fit. Finally, people say, well, not finally yet. Some people say, this is too complicated, I really don't want to think about it, I'm going to find somebody who would take my money and fix it for me. They go to an MSSP or an MDR and they say, can you monitor my GCE? And the managed provider says, what's GCE? At this point, you already know. You're not going to have a good experience because they know cloud even less than you do. Some of the people call MSS MDR providers security from the cloud. Let me assure you, some of them do not know cloud. Some of them do. So, yes, there are places you can outsource some of the cloud threat detection and response activities, but the list is way shorter than you'd think. Now, this is too silly, and this is not 2012 anymore, so I'm not touching this one. I've met people who still believe that, but like, leave it for later. So, what actually works? Now, frankly, while I've met enough cloud purists, especially at Google, to me, gradually moving their thinking from, okay, I'm keeping these parts of my on-premise stack, I'm keeping my IDS, I'm keeping my EDR, I'm keeping my SIM for sure, maybe I'm not keeping my packet capture, and then I would figure out where my business and IT changes and where I jettison certain tools, replace them with cloud equivalents, or in some cases I realize that the purpose for the tool no longer exists. In this case, I jettison the tool, I don't replace it with anything. So to me, this type of gradual approach married to largely on-premise thinking has worked for people. If you are a cloud native, if you started your company in the cloud, you should be making faces at me thinking Anton is stupid. Yes, for you this approach is no-go. You're not copying anybody's on-premise stack. You are doing things the cloud native way. But in my experience, the majority of organizations who are moving to the cloud as opposed to born in the cloud may well benefit from using some of the thinking from here and then gradually moving to more cloud things. And finally, this sounds like a very generic advice, and I will give you a more factual, more narrow version of this. But you will still invest in your SOC in learning cloud. Like it's not going to be the most exciting. Well, some of the GCP classes are quite exciting, but it won't be the most exciting thing you learn. It's not about like pandas and threat actors, but you will have to learn cloud so that you would deal with it as at least a cloud tourist, if not a cloud native. This this is a super quick review, and you can poke holes in it because this is of course a high level revision of like what kind of tools do I have? I have my EDR. Does EDR work? Obviously the EDR does not work for SaaS. There's no endpoint, there's no E. EDR may work for IaaS, infrastructure as a service. I've seen people with pretty massive deployments of EDR in the cloud. Are they happy? They're okay. I guess I can, sometimes I may think they're overpaying, but ultimately it's an approach that would work to an extent. Packet capture, you can make it work if you're lucky. You're probably doing a lot of flow, a lot less full packet capture because likely a lot of stuff is encrypted, but you have this slide kind of not only promotes SIM a little bit and other type of log-based detections, but it kind of implies that you're starting from on-premise stack as a first step is partially okay if you are mostly in IaaS. For SaaS, many people kind of go with CASB or its recent kind of a superset SASE. The point is that you are likely using logs, or you're using this fancy new observability trends to see logs from inside the applications, and then you're probably automating with SOAR, because as you discover, as that SOC manager will discover when he travels to the cloud, a lot of stuff is a lot more automated, which probably means heavier SOAR use for him. Now, security presentations aren't allowed to have slides that say good news, because it's supposed to be like all gloom and gloom, but there are definitely areas where cloud just dramatically improves things. Of course, your SIM that beckons to the cloud or your EDR that beckons to the cloud would work better than the previous version when you had to buy the servers. So these are kind of likely positives. SOAR would work better because there's a lot of stuff in the cloud that's API driven. That means SOAR wouldn't have to do strange things and scraping and calling unlisted APIs, but call public APIs, have things happen. Logs are usually easier to get. You are not scraping directories for big fat files and then parsing them. You're likely requesting logs over API. So telemetry collection ends up being cleaner, faster in many cases, and more reliable. So to me, that's good news. Now, your cloud provider ultimately would build threat detection tools on their end. My favorite example is, of course, our VMTD, Virtual Machine Threat Detection. It is sort of magically identify crypto miners without any presence in the VM. It's done purely from the back plane. If you have time to read the blog post on VMTD, take a look, because to a lot of people it sounds like magic. Somebody wanted to run a honeypot in GCP, and they wanted crypto miners in the honeypot. Crypto miners kept dying. Why are they dying? Well, because Google's technology from the backends detects them and shuts them down. So it's not a good use case for honeypots, but it's a great use case for a detection technology that just works from the cloud provider side. There will be more of that from us for sure, and likely from other providers, from other cloud providers as well. Now, final bit of good news, and this is like a favorite point of our CISO, Phil Venables. Generally speaking, security in the cloud would get better over time. So even if you do nothing, certain things would be more secure, would be more encryption, key management would get more robust, likely more telemetry sources will get monitored. So in some sense, your data center security wouldn't improve on its own, but your cloud security in fact will improve. To me, this is a good argument, and I'm almost sad I didn't think about it, but Phil did. So, what can we actually do? Now, this is a legal tongue-in-cheek, but ultimately, I've stepped on this bit of advice multiple times. Like, if there's one thing you remember from Espresso is, when you journey to the cloud, learn IAM. And when I was an analyst at Gartner, I thought IAM is deathly boring. And frankly, I secretly still think that. But in the cloud, a lot of your crown jewels, a lot of your business would rely on you, the SOC manager, knowing IAM. Because otherwise you probably would miss a lot of signals, a lot of activities. And the screenshots and stuff here is just to remind people that IAM in the cloud, identity in the cloud, is quite different. And even a lot of words and roles and like, oh, they impersonated the service account. What does it mean? What's the Windows equivalent of that? Well, there isn't any. You have to learn a little bit more of a context around it. Oh, it's a custom role. We'll just define a custom role. What is it exactly? It's kind of like privileges in Active Directory. Actually, no, it's not. It's some cloud-specific thing connected to identity, and to understand whether certain activities and events refer to these things, you have to know that they exist, A, and B, what they are, So to me, if there's one bit of advice on this, if you're starting to run cloud, don't just like go cloud computing 101. Go cloud IAM 101. That would help you run your detection and response mission a lot better because you would know a lot of things. Funny enough, I was reading, please don't laugh, some Azure documentation, and they mentioned that it's a distinguished resource. And I'm like, I don't know what this is. I have to go look up the dictionary. Like it was a concept from IAM. I don't think you have the equivalent, or I haven't learned that word yet. So the point is that a lot of this becomes new knowledge for a SOC manager, but it's also kind of essential knowledge. You know what, I'll skip it. I'll just go straight to recommendations. So, what can we do and what other things we can do except for learning IAM? So I did say this again, sounds very generic, but ultimately I hope I motivated you to look for things like IAM and things like some other cloud practices and activities, because these serve as context for the events you observe. Sure, some of it may be about SSH password guessing. We have a detection in our cloud, in our sort of security command center, detection for SSH password guessing. It's very on-prem style, so there's no real difference in this particular one. But a lot of things like granting certain permissions in IAM, if I've never seen cloud, I wouldn't know what the implications are. Granting permission sounds vaguely bad. So, threat assessment. Another, if you remember two things, the second thing would be like, you probably need to think a lot harder about what threats matter to you in the cloud. It won't be the carbon copy of your regular threat assessment. It will be something that's colored by that, but it will be different. And it's largely up to you to figure out what threats matter. And it may be generic, maybe cryptominers, maybe malware, maybe password guessing, but there will be other things that are on that list. This advice gets copied from previous presentations to the next presentation I've given every year since 2004, maybe. How about that? If you're doing detection, you have to clarify your use cases, and for cloud, it's a bit more work because you kind of, if you go to your traditional SIEM vendor and say, what are your top 5 cloud threat detection use cases, you may not get a very insightful answer. Sometimes you would, sometimes you wouldn't. In another case, you would get a crisp answer that does not match your threat model, which would be like, oh, wait a second. Great answer, but not for me. Prepare to live in the world where automation is a lot more tolerated. In our podcast, we did this episode, I think it was episode 2, which was called Automate or Die. And the reason for this name was that when security manager, SOC manager encounters cloud, he's shocked at a lot of things that are kind of taboo to automate on-prem are in fact routinely automated in the cloud. Systems are shut down from APIs, things are cut off from the network, and nobody cries about it. So when you start expanding the SOC responsibility to this environment, you will see, and thus you will use a lot more automation, and it's unavoidable. And learning how the DevOps teams, how site reliability engineers do it, becomes a path to that. Now, this is another bit of good news. My point about security getting better also means that your cloud provider would build more things and likely give some of them to you, or sell some of the others, give some to you, and you would have certain detections just come magically from the CSP side, and likely they would be quite effective because of the scale we rely on to operate. Finally, this sounds like a bit of a cliche, bit of advice, because ultimately it applies to on-prem. If you have a great SOC in an environment with a really bad basic security hygiene, you're not going to have a great SOC for long, because all your best people would leave. They would be too tired to work in an environment where 90% of their stuff is phishing. So in the cloud, it matters even more. If all you have is, oh look, open a 3 bucket, let's deal with it. It doesn't make for a very exciting life if you're in a SOC. So a lot of this has to be handled somewhere else, CSPM tools, blueprints from cloud provider, but hygiene matters a lot more because minor hygiene mistakes in the cloud, especially IAM mistakes, this IAM comes back to bite you, matter a lot more in terms of producing noise, in terms of failures, in terms of other things. So your SOC would likely be influencing, at least somewhat, how people do hygiene in the cloud. And yes, that may mean dealing with developers, probably not the most fun task for a SOC manager. So, reminder, we sort of looked at what we are doing, like how cloud matters, where cloud matters. We looked at what we have and how well it functions. And at the end, learn IAM, look at some of the activities, work on the threat model hard, deal with other things. Thank you very much for your attention.
love when you end on an optimistic Anton note, so some good recommendations, really practical stuff. That's what we want to always do. Anton's going to be hanging around, so there's no better mind in the space to pick. So he'll be here. We might have a second good mind. Okay. But please say hello to Anton. We'll also have some great demos going on here, and we're going to be back at you in about 30 minutes with another talk. Thank you, everyone. And pick up some swag, too. We got swag somewhere. Thank you.
Well,